Hello, everybody, and welcome to another show. I'm so excited for what we got for you guys tonight. We got Caleb Jackson on talking about miracles, and I just want you guys to know that I'm excited to hear about it. Caleb's excited to talk about it, and I've got a special treat for you guys here. I know Tyler's not here right now, but we've got Dale Glover co-hosting with me. You know, the guy that likes milk. He likes bags of milk. And yeah, so we got Caleb and Dale on tonight. And yeah, stay tuned and be ready for a wild ride. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition to Faith Unaltered. I'm your host, David Russell, and I'm here with my co-host, Dale Glover, who has his camera off tonight, and my man and former co-host and still part of the team, Caleb Jackson. What's up, guys?
Hey, David. How's it going?
What's up?
Good. So let's start with you, Dale, man. How's your week been, bro, since we were on last?
Well, I would say pretty good. There was one thing that sucks. So it's final exams for my students and stuff. So this Wednesday, I had to wake up at like 6 a.m. and be there for like 7:30 a.m. To invigilate the exam from 8 to 11. So that wasn't so fun. But other than that, yeah, it's going pretty good.
Awesome. Caleb, what's going on, man?
It's going. Christmas is around the corner. Work's been busy. Been trying to go on other shows and do stuff like this. So it's been quite a ride. But happy to be here again to be where I kind of started off. So it's always nice to see that and to see the people who kind of got me started into theology and into apologetics. So yeah, it's always great to be here.
Right on. Well, I'm glad I could help facilitate that journey. No, I'm just joking.
All to you. Yeah.
It's all me. No, I'm just joking. No. You have been making waves, man. I'm very proud of your work, and I watched your show on capturing Christianity, and I thought you did a fabulous job laying out your criteria and a case for miracles, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, guys. Is miracles.
David, you could be on a show like that if you weren't a heretic.
People don't invite me because I'm very controversial. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, you get them shaking their boots. Yeah. Well, I will say that you all have been making rounds. I know Pine Creek did a response to you all with Tim Stratton the other day. So
yeah.
Apparently big enough to get attention of some fairly high profile atheist YouTubers.
Yeah, we also got some pretty high profile theist YouTubers that were commenting on the debate we hosted with Tim Stratton and Chris Date. That was pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
So we've been getting hit from both sides, but most of it's been good. And, I'm happy to say that we're getting content out there for everybody to look into and everybody to see. And that's one of the reasons I wanted you on here tonight, because you made such an excellent case and we wanted to talk about miracles. So what do you have for us tonight? What is a miracle, Caleb?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you asked it in that, what do you have for us tonight? Because I wanted this to be just a lot more informal. I know we were planning on having other people here as well. It's a lot more dialogue oriented. It's not like a full presentation, just had a couple slides with pictures. So yeah, if you want to go see like the full, more laid out presentation, neater, go look at the stream on Cameron's channel about miracles. I would recommend that, Capture Christianity. But here we're just going to kind of lay out some stuff that I didn't cover as much, or maybe want to go on more and just elaborate on that. So yeah, thanks for that. When it comes to what is a miracle, there are lots of different definitions. Some people define it as a violation of the laws of nature. Other people define it as acts of providence. I would say that a miracle is that it's an intervention of natural law that could not have occurred without God's involvement in that way. So essentially, it's something that only God can do that stands out from how nature typically works, I think is the best one. So it's not just an event that's highly unlikely or unusual, but something that would not be able to happen had nature gone its typical course. So I think that's the safest definition. So if you're defining a miracle that way, then yes, by definition, if any miracle exists, God must exist because he's part of the definition. So it's really the question of, well, have miracles occurred, and how would we know if they have occurred? And if we were convinced some strange stuff did occur, how would we therefore infer that God was behind it? So those are the really big questions that I wanted to look at in the book that I'm still writing. It's been almost 2 years now, started in January of 2021. So I'm hoping that it will be done and out sometime in 2023, probably not until later in the year, but we'll have to see how that goes. So
how's that process going for you? I mean, is it
it's going? I think I'm done collecting cases. I'm at 50 cases. I think that's probably a good place to stop, because you just go up and up and up. So and not just 50, like including like 50 like case studies that I look into and spend several pages on each typically. So it's a long book. I'm close to 500 pages right now. I'm guessing the book will be about 600 to 700 when it's done, is what I'm estimating. So it's pretty lengthy. Yeah, but that's how it's going. So it's going well. But in the book, I kind of divide into sections. So first we start off with introduction. What is a miracle? Then we have a long chapter on criteria. How do we define a miracle? What are we looking for? What are we not looking for? Then there's a series of chapters on Pentecostal Christian miracles. There's a series of chapters on Roman Catholic miracles. And then there's a series of chapters on a subject that really has not gotten that much attention in the literature at all, of a phenomenon that I call veridical Christic experiences, of VCE. Like how there's NDEs, near-death experiences, veridical Christic experience is what I call it, a VCE. And those are modern, we'll say, visions or experiences of Jesus in a way that is veridical. So not just in people who have visions of Jesus and that's it, that's all fine and good, but visions where people are either healed afterwards of something that's medically inexplicable, or they receive information they didn't know, or there's some kind of physical thing left over in that way. So anything that seems that would indicate something outside the mind in that way. So I spent several chapters on that. And then I go into philosophical considerations. We can talk a little bit about that here as well. I know Travis isn't on at the moment, but I spend.
He got back to me. He's not feeling good, so
okay, that's probably Tyler's not out. Is Tyler also busy?
Tyler actually had to he double booked, so that's why he's not here.
Oh, gotcha.
He accidentally double booked, and the people reminded him that he double booked. So he was like,
"Oh, that's fine." Well, in fairness to our audience, we did set this up kind of not last minute, but didn't. Yeah, so that's why it is. But it's good. We'll trounce through it.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But yeah, so sorry, I didn't want to get sidetracked. But yeah,
no, it's fine.
So philosophical considerations about, like, David Hume's famous argument against miracles. Can we trust testimony over the regularity of nature? That I spent a long time on that, and I spent time on an argument that's not as well known, but I think it's really interesting, by a philosopher named James Keller. At least he's the most popular. I don't know if it's been by people before him, but he actually argues that miracles are immoral because they're unfair. And so we can talk a little bit about that if you want, because that's not usually discussed. But he thinks miracle claims are an argument against theism, or at least inconsistent with theism. And then the last chapters I spend talking about looking at potential natural explanations for miracles, and then looking at hypothesizing a supernatural explanation and making the leap between this happened and then a supernatural explanation is the best explanation. So that's kind of the layout that I'm planning on, at least that I currently have set up for the book. And that's typically how I would go about it. So we're not going to talk about all of that tonight, but that's a good way I would introduce someone to the topic. So yeah, any
Right on.
questions so far?
Absolutely, man. First, the first question I did want to ask you, and then I'll kick it to Dale, was how is your book different than what's already out there? Do you think that you've offered something new and exciting to the whole conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that my book is different in a couple of different ways. First, I think, although some books do this, most of them don't. I think I spend a lot more time on criteria, and I hamper a lot more on that, and I hamper a lot more on method. I think I also have a wider diversity of claims. So, for example, Craig Keener has cases mostly in the Pentecostal realm because that's where his connections are. Candy Brown, who also does research in this, also does Pentecostal healings typically. And then you have people who do Catholic healings, and they usually just focus on that. So I'm taking the Pentecostal, I'm taking the Catholic, and I'm taking the visions of Jesus, which doesn't have hardly any attention in the literature, and I'm putting it all into it. So I think my book is a lot more wide encompassing and a little bit more broad in its scope. Although I do spend a lot more time on specific cases than people like Brown or Keener would. Usually, if you've read like Keener's book, for example, at least his scholarly one, he has a newer one that's a little bit more, spends a little bit more time on individual cases. It's a lot more of anecdotes where it's so and so saw this, and then we spend 2 sentences and move on. And I'm not condemning that, but I did want to be very in depth with the medical side of this. And I'm not a doctor personally, but I do have physicians like Dr. Joe Bergeron, for example, helping me look through this on a fairly general medical level. And I've also ran it by a few other people as well, even some skeptics as well. So I'm trying to get as fair of a shake as I can. And there have been cases that I ended up taking out because I thought yeah, that could probably be explained. And so I was like, yeah, maybe not good. So 50 is why is a good number I wanted to stop at and come down to. I had more that I could easily have 70 if I include the ones I didn't think were that strong. But 50 ones that I think are pretty solid overall. So that's kind of the general layout. And I also spend time on the philosophy. I think I also spend more time than at least most people I know in terms of the explanation, in terms of how do we get to a supernatural explanation? How do we hypothesize that? I think most of the books I'm familiar with don't spend that much time on that. So I do think I cover topics that a lot of people don't. I think I have cases that a lot of them don't. And I'm trying to make this one of the best resources on it to date. And I hope people after me write even more comprehensive stuff that cover stuff that I didn't. So I'm just excited to see how that goes.
Right on, Dale. I'm going to pass it to you. You have a question and where you want to start or whatever? You're muted, Dale.
Yeah, sure. So obviously he hasn't given his presentation yet, but just I guess 3 kind of quick intro questions then. So one thing, you mentioned that you had 50 cases and stuff like that. I'm sort of curious, do you also look at cases from other religions at all? Or is there any kind of compare and contrast with miracles in other religions, or is it purely Christian?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 50 ones I have are Christian, and the book is primarily focused on Christian healings. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is because it's making argument for Christian theism, and the second one is I really couldn't find that many, at least with the criteria I set up. It was hard to find ones in other religions, and I think part of that is because Christianity is a bit of a westernized religion, so documentation is going to be better in the West typically, at least from like a medical and scientific perspective. So it was hard to find ones that were not purely anecdotal, although there are a handful of ones I think are interesting. So I do at least plan on having an appendix right now about that I'll call like the superiority of Christian miracles or something like that, where I will contrast Christian miracles and how they serve functionally versus other general miracle claims in other religions. So I think that might be room for an appendix, but I don't spend like a lot of time on Islamic miracles or Hinduism and stuff like that. Although I do think there's at least like some interesting stuff there that still might not hold up in my opinion.
Awesome. All right, cool. And of the 50 cases that you do look at, so obviously these are selected by you because they're highly evidential cases. I'm just wondering, with all 50, like in terms of your criteria, and again, you haven't taught us about them yet, but would you say that all 50 cases fulfill all your criteria, or is there like a minimal threshold? How does that work? Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So, we didn't plan these out in advance, so I'm actually glad, because that kind of grows into what I was going to get into with some of the short presentation. But yeah, so there are 7 criteria that I'll explain this on the slide, but I didn't invent these, but that I use that I think are good. And so I actually am planning on having, I might have an appendix that has all of them in a spreadsheet, but I at least have an Excel sheet that has all 50 right now. And I have it where I literally have the boxes checked for each one. And so I would say almost all of them are either so there's 7 criteria. All of them are either get a 6 or a 7 score. Typically, I think there's 1 or 2 that I have that are like maybe a 5, but anything that was like typically 5s or lower, I didn't count because it wasn't enough. So and there were if someone is impressed, I could explain why I kept the 2 5s, because I think they were exceptional for different reasons. But generally, I would say 6 or 7 is what I'm looking for. So if it's a 5, unless it's something that's really singular and really interesting, 5 or lower, I'm probably just not going to feel confident enough to include it. But yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it, at least for being careful. And I bet some of these are pretty strict. So there could be people who really are healed who just don't happen to have the documentation or don't happen to fulfill the criteria. And I'm not here to say God did not heal them. That is not what the criteria meant to do. It's just saying that to weed out other natural explanations. You can say God healed someone through natural means providentially. I don't have an issue with that. I just wouldn't call it a miracle in the sense that I was defining it. So
awesome.
That's how it's looked at.
All right, cool. And my last kind of intro question, again, after your presentation, we can maybe get into it in more detail if you want. But in terms of methodology, so you mentioned you do have a part where it's philosophical, focusing on David Hume and his argument against miracles or against using testimonial evidence. And I think I sent you back in the day a couple papers on the epistemology of testimony and how that works. So I was just wondering, did you incorporate any discussion on that topic? Because I find it interesting.
Yes, yeah. So I think I'm going to have the Hume chapter in 2 parts, where it's one of them is laying it out and one of them rebutting it. So yes, I do give long ones, and I think that most people who comment on Hume's argument, and so just so the audience knows, that if I were to summarize David Hume's argument, it's from a pretty well-known essay called Of Miracles that he wrote in the 18th century. To sum it up really briefly, it would basically be premise 1: the laws and regularities of nature are extremely well established, more so than anything else that we know of, and miracles are a violation of these laws. Premise 2: miracles are backed up primarily, almost exclusively, by human testimony, and human testimony is extremely flawed, especially in the context of miracles. Therefore, premise 3: no amount of human testimony, at least the kinds that we observe, would ever be sufficient to override the extremely good evidence we see from nature being regular. So Hume's basically saying, if you have this really good evidence of natural law and you have this really kind of poor evidence of human testimony, anytime they conflict, it's always going to be natural law being regular every time over testimony, because we just know testimony has too many issues. And so I think the first premise is just really not persuasive at all, because it's not wrong, but it's without going into detail, there's plenty of ways in which natural laws can be upheld without being violated with closed systems and thermodynamics. But the second premise is at least a little bit justified, because he's not wrong in the sense that there are people who have uncredible testimony. There are people who are credulous. There are people who are willing to lie. There are people who are too willing to believe a miracle. And so many things he says are fairly accurate and are fair. It's yeah, that's true. There are times of testimony that we shouldn't trust. And so I think, and people like Tim McGrew have done a really good job of laying this out, to have standards and have criteria for that as well. So, for example, Tim McGrew and my friend Eric Manning as well from Testify have used what they call the DOUBTS filter as an acronym, DOUTS. DOUBTS. And it's reports that are distant, that happen from really, really far away places that we can't investigate. Shouldn't like those. The O is reports that are opinions that are already established. So if there are reports that come from people who are already really believing in it, if you go to India and there's a guru who allegedly does miracles, and all the witnesses are people who are already like diehard disciples who see this, and they're people who don't care about him. It's like, yeah, I've never been impressed, or I've never seen anything incredible from him. That might be a little bit of a red flag if it's only people who are already predisposed to kind of want this to be true and won't be cynical or skeptical towards it. The U is uncertain events, so stuff like I prayed and then it started raining. It's like, well, rain can happen. Like, it's not stuff that's like not really, that impressive, or could be fairly easily explained naturally. The B is belated events. We don't want testimony that's really, really, really late. I heard it from so-and-so who heard it from so-and-so, or it was written down 40, 50 years later. Want to try to avoid that. At least it's preferable to have early testimony than not. I think the D was theologically insignificant. So if it's something that just happens randomly with no religious context, maybe that's an anomaly, but there's no reason to associate it with God. And S would be self-serving. We don't want testimony that comes from people who are obviously making a lot of money or gaining power, or, like what Joseph Smith gained 40 wives, or whatever you can think of reasons. So if someone is like making a lot of money by selling a big book on this, or getting fame, or getting sex or power or whatever, that would at least be a little bit of a caution we should take in terms of just accepting their testimony if that's helping them get that stuff. So that's stuff we would want to avoid, the kinds of testimonies. So when you put those on, you get rid of a lot of the claims you have to look at.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
no,
Thanks.
absolutely. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So once we apply that, though, I think that we can apply that on testimony. Once we have those filters on, testimony can be upheld as almost as strong as evidence as anything else. In fact, we use In fact, most of the scientific method, at least when we read about it, is testimonial. Psychological studies are hard to replicate, and most of the results we get from the testimony of people who did the experiment, and so forth. So there's lots of things that aren't like directly replicable that we take on testimony, and we don't spend time going to test every single thing when we read it, because I don't believe you. And even if you think it was replicated, you have to believe the people who said they replicated it, unless you were there watching it being replicated. So it's not like we can just we can say testimony should always be thrown out, because even though there are, for example, studies that show that memory can be unreliable, that's very true. Those studies rely on testimonial evidence. At least I'm reading people telling me their memory was unreliable, right? So I wasn't there to see it. So it's like, oh, how do you know they didn't misremember the study? Well, it's like, well, they probably had recording audio and so forth. But point is, like, if you just want to throw out anything that you didn't see yourself, then you'd be throwing out a lot of science and history and so forth. So we shouldn't just say testimony is this broad umbrella as if it's just one thing. Testimony has to be qualified with the level of it. So it depends on what kind of testimony. We just can't treat all testimony like it's the same.
Right. And that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, that's kind of how we come through the learning process there, right? I mean, we learn from other people's testimony, repeat the experiment, or take a different route and either discover something new or discover they're wrong, or we sift through it. But that's how we do it. We sift through testimony. The testimony, we've come to learn our natural sciences from other people's testimony. I mean, when I'm growing up, going through high school and learning all about biology or astronomy, I'm actually learning it from other people and what experiments they did, and then doing them myself and learning that way, right? I mean, I think it's just, I think it was a misguided notion from Hume that undercut that whole entire argument. And unfortunately, it's the popular argument, right? It gained precedence because I know he was responded to back in his time.
Yeah, Joseph Butler and others. Yes, yeah.
So yeah, that was one of my other questions, was like about Hume. Like, what do you think about that? And isn't that just assuming that isn't he just assuming a worldview that excludes God? Is that what he's doing?
Well, what Hume wants to do is he wants to set that there are people who debate on the exegesis of Hume, because some people say, well, Hume is not saying that we could never, ever affirm a miracle didn't happen. He's just saying that, like, he's just setting the standards. He's saying, here's what we would need. We don't have that, so we should still be skeptical until that evidence comes about. Other people read Hume as saying, no, this is actually, like, definitively an argument against any miracle ever being affirmed. Hume at one point calls it an everlasting check against all superstition. So not only is it like, okay, here's the standards, and maybe it could theoretically reach this, but it won't, but basically saying it would never in principle be able to reach that standard. And so I think Hume would probably say, even if you had the best case of someone rising from the dead ever, like we had all these witnesses, all these doctors and stuff, and like you could verify all the details. We still have hundreds, or at least probably close to 100 billion examples of people not rising from the dead. And so the evidence that people stay dead is 100, close to 100 billion times better than any evidence you could ever give of someone rising from the dead. And so if these are competing, we have to either choose people always dead or stay dead, or people can rise from the dead. You're always going to have people staying dead. Now, of course, that's a false dichotomy, because he's acting like if we have one exception, the laws are just thrown out. And that's a criticism as well that he can't receive. But Hume gives examples where he's like, imagine we had the queen, I think it was Elizabeth or Victoria, I forget, probably Victoria, die, and we had all the world's doctors come to her funeral and verify she was dead, and that she was seen 3 days later walking again and took control of her throne in front of everybody and made all this journalists. We still wouldn't believe it. We still would be say this is fake, that she either faked her death or this was an imposter, and we would still be rational to reject this and throw it out. He says this with he gives an example of a person living in a hot country like India who meets a traveler from a faraway land who says, oh yeah, in our land, our horses can walk on water because the water gets so cold that it actually becomes solid like a rock. And this person who lives in this tropical environment has never seen ice before. And that's quite an incredible claim. And even if he had all these witnesses telling him, oh yeah, we have this solid rock, but we can't bring it to you because if we do, it'll melt and become water. How convenient. We should just reject that. We should say, well, no, I know water can't become solid, and so I would reject this. Now, of course, the obvious response is, but it does, and he would be wrong in that case. But that's just, I think, showing that. And he also gives other examples of, he even quotes the, so before we went on air, Dale and I were talking about a particular case that I mentioned on Cameron's stream regarding Miguel Piecer, who was a 17th century Spaniard who had a leg amputated and allegedly got it back in a miracle. And Hume mentions this case in the essay. And he says, like, look, we have dozens of witnesses to this. Some of them educated and all these people credible. And yet we know this didn't happen. We don't even have, not even that, but we don't even have to investigate it. We don't have to even bother. He basically says, I don't even have to prove to you that the testimony is false. I can simply assert that because I know this can't happen. We know this can't happen. We know that any testimony is going to be prima facie more unlikely than this actually happening. So we don't even have to bother to investigate it because we know that this can't happen. Now, some people might say that's circular and begging the question. But that was Hume's assertion that any testimony in principle simply shouldn't be trusted because it's going to be flawed, especially if it comes from religious sects. Now, if you have an example, and Hume gives an example, like let's say that the sun just goes dark in the sky and everyone records this, and it goes dark for like several days or at least a long time. And we have this, we would believe the sun really went dark, but we couldn't say it was a miracle because it didn't have a religious context. But if it did have a religious context, if a religion is promoting something, we are prima facie skeptical because religions have reasons to lie. People are credulous in religious circles. They want to believe it's true. And people who start religions want power or money, and they have a lot of motivation to lie. So on the one hand, if it happens in an outside religious context, it might be more believable, but it doesn't get you to a God. And if it happens in a religious context, it's automatically less believable because religious people are automatically less trustworthy because of these reasons. So that's basically how Hume pictures testimony.
Awesome. Do you mind if am I allowed to share?
Yeah, go ahead.
David Hume, or yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Let me share the screen here for a second. Because I did my own show on David Hume and miracles.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I can send you the link if you want to see my
Nice.
thing. So here are my slides. So here's kind of what my interpretation of the in principle argument of Hume is, right? So he's premise one, the experiential evidence for the laws of nature is much stronger than any possible testimonial evidence and that sort of thing. And, premise two is just evidentialism. We should proportion our belief to the evidence. So therefore, the evidence is you should just automatically disbelieve almost any and all testimonial evidence. And that's kind of why I wanted to ask you, Caleb, because I'm fascinated with what's called the epistemology of testimony. And basically there's two fundamental positions on how we treat testimonial evidence, whereas or three, right? So there's testimony skepticism. Virtually nobody is this, but this is just, it's guilty. You disbelieve it and just assume it's false until it's absolutely proven true. Nobody goes for that. So in philosophy, the debate is between reductionism, which from my understanding from your answer, Caleb, you actually, with the doubts method, you would go for a reductionist stance, right? We need to have independent positive reasons to think that the testimony we're receiving is reliable before we
Correct.
believe. And believe it or not, that position was started with David Hume. So you would actually agree with Hume on that one. But through my studies, I actually have changed my mind. I think I go for an anti-reductionism, which kind of says, look, testimonial evidence it's innocent until proven guilty. It itself is as basic as sense data or any other form of gaining knowledge, memory, or through deriving through logic. It kind of sees them on an equal par. Someone like Richard Swinburne, he has a principle of testimony and that sort of thing. But yeah, I was just kind of interested in your take on that debate because I changed my mind from.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Dale, because that's kind of, I think, Keener's approach. Because Keener just says if it's a reliable witness who is like otherwise trustworthy, like someone you really like, if it was your spouse or like your best friend, and they weren't lying, and they weren't kidding or lying, like if they were dead serious and extremely persistent, you probably would believe them, even if it was something like really incredible. That's I think what Keener would argue, and I understand why people would say that. My issue is not that I don't trust people like that. I think they're deliberately being dishonest. My issue why I'm more of a reductionist is because I think there are other explanations that are more likely initially, and that I think we have to rule those out. I think we have to put our controls in. So I think you have starting hypotheses, and you have to basically check them off until you get to the reliability one for unlikely claims. I don't mean for everything, but in that way. So if someone thinks they were healed and comes and tells me, I will probably believe them, not like skeptically that they're being sincere. I usually take people at their word. I don't usually think people are lying, but I would question like, well, is it placebo? Like, did you really get healed? Like, well, what was the diagnosis? I want those specifics because I do know there are people who think they are and are not. And so obviously that'd be a defeater. But I do think that we have to rule out false memory and so forth. So those are the things I'm trying to look to rule out. To give you an example, at least that I use. So people often say the claim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We've all heard this before. And I don't think that's true. I would say extraordinary claims require more controls, but the evidence actually does not have to be great or of a different kind. So to give an example, let's say, we had 3 guys named Dale, Caleb, and David. We'll just say non-specifically, who come to you all and say, oh, our best friend, we saw our best friend die 3 days ago, and he was up and talking to us and eating with us today, and he vanished. And oh, that's like super strange. And they were like really persistent. You would probably be pretty cynical towards that and be like, well, you probably wouldn't know what to think of it. So let's say that we had that same exact scenario, but we have a different possible world we can imagine where we can test. We have developed let's say that we've developed polygraphs in this possible world so well where it can test brain chemistry and instantly know whether or not someone's lying. And let's say that people are on we've developed medications and drugs that make our memory and so forth recall super sharp and less prone to error. Okay, so let's say that you had that exact scenario. These 3 guys come up and tell you our friend rose from the dead. We saw all this stuff, and you were able to have them take a polygraph. And you were able to show that they were taking this medication and show that their brains were at the optimal level where they wouldn't have possibly where it couldn't have hallucinated or done that. If you could do that, then, and we still have their testimony. That's the evidence is they're telling us this happened, but we can rule out those other potentials of lying or being honestly mistaken. Then I think that would be really good evidence, even though the evidence in most cases is just the testimony of these 3 people. The evidence is actually not different, but it's the fact that in the second example, the testimonial evidence is stronger because we've gotten rid of those other possible candidates, even though it's still testimonial evidence. So I don't think it's the amount of evidence is different. It's more just we've put more controls on this one, and we've been able to rule out other options with this kind of evidence than we were with the first example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to let me kind of clarify one last thing here, and I'll share my screen just for the audience and stuff. But so if I've got you right, you wouldn't necessarily be like a global reductionist, right? So that all testimony we have to have positive reasons to believe testimony is reliable in general, right? No matter what the claim. If I understand, you're kind of saying when it comes to a specific type of testimony, you're a local reductionist, right? For miracle reports, we need to have positive reasons for that, or would you just say across the board for we need to have general proof that testimony is reliable in general before we believe it?
Yeah, because I think those kinds of claims are so there. First of all, they're so like ordinary claims are so common to where I don't really need like, okay, if someone tells me that they have a Chevy, like it's not uncommon. And it's also the probability, because they're habitually truthful, the probability of them lying to me or being mistaken about that is way lower than probability of them actually having a Chevy. So you would just be stupid to not believe them, or at least unless you just have good reasons, unless you had a positive reason not to. But when you have a claim that has a pretty low prior, and the probability of them lying or misperceiving something is a lot higher, and we have more examples of that, that's when you have to balance that scale out. So it depends on whether or not in any given case A, the probability of them lying or being mistaken is lower than the probability of them telling the truth. And I would say with most claims that have a very high, I don't want to take a frequentist view of probability, but with claims that are very common, probability of them telling the truth is automatically very high, especially if they're trustworthy, and so forth. So that's just how I look at it. You just have to balance those out.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So yeah, I know you have like an opening presentation. This is before the intro, so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No. So this.
Oh, Caleb, you're muted.
You muted yourself, buddy.
Oh no. Okay. Let there be sound. Okay. Yeah, we'll just go to the criteria stuff because we're talking about that anyway, and that's the first slide on there. So if I can get, share screen, Chrome tab, that. All right, so miracle. This is a short one, so this is kind of just an indux of other streams I've done. But to get to the criteria of a healing miracle, so this is different than the doubts criteria. Doubts is for testimonial evidence in general, not at least for what it comes to.
Hey, Caleb, you want to
claim
widen that up?
Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah,
yep.
Like that.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yep. So we can see it. Yep.
So the reason I focus primarily on healing miracles, and I have, I think, one or two exceptions, probably one in the book, that's particularly unique that I talked about on Cameron's case, is I think healing miracles are the most. First of all, they're the most common by far. I think it's close to 97% or so or more are healing miracles, and that's because God is benevolent. God does miracles to help us with suffering as part of theodicy. And so those are more common than the show-offy kind of walking on water, calling down fire from heaven miracles, at least from what I've been able to find, and I think historically as well. But they're also good because although I don't think we can just replicate them where we can, there are studies where people have tried praying for people in controlled conditions, and they don't usually give very good results. But I also don't think we can predict when or where God will act. And so I'm not so interested in predicting who God's going to heal or if he does heal. It's more of the fact that for any given person who claimed that they have been healed, can we investigate that and confirm or deny that's likely? And so the good thing about healing miracles is that although you can't replicate the actual event in the healing, you can and technically have replicated the conditions. So if someone's diagnosed with a certain disease, we can, and usually these are like long term, not just they got sick once. Like someone who's been sick for like a decade with a particular condition, they've gone to the doctor multiple times, been seen by independent specialists. We can review that and document that and do our little experiment of diagnosing them and saying, yep, they really are sick, and it's probably this, and these really are their symptoms. And this, helps us rule out, not definitively, but like with a pretty high degree of probability of people misremembering or getting details wrong if we have, written documentation on multiple occasions by independent people. And same with them being cured. We can actually test that. If someone says, okay, I no longer have this disease and I no longer need medication, we can go and we can look at the records and we can do a test right here and now if we had the equipment to see if they really are healed. So that can be replicated as well. So the condition of they were sick with this and the posterior condition of now I'm healed can both be verifiably and scientifically and analyzed just as we would with anything else. And we would take the testimony of that doctor in any other circumstance, even in a court of law, in terms of, when we do malpractice cases, for example, testifying like they really had this and this was really the surgery, and that would be applicable under any court of law with any credentialed doctor. So I think testimony for that is really strong. The question just is that middle part of the temporal connection to prayer. And that's what we want to get into here. So this is called the Lambertini criterion. And the name comes from a cardinal in the 18th century who would later become Pope Benedict XIV. This is before he was Pope. And he came up with the criteria that were used for the modern canonization practice of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church requires that, with the exception of people who've been martyred, most people who want to be saints have to have at least 2 miracles. It used to be 4; it's now dropped to 2. Or one for beatification, which is where they're locally recognized as a saint, and one for canonization, which is where they're recognized as a saint by the entire Holy See, by the entire Catholic Church, and they can be prayed to by anyone. So these are the criteria typically used. So first one is healing and diagnosis both need to be medically documented. There are a few exceptions to this, but typically there needs to be at least several witnesses, preferably doctors. In best case scenario, you have biopsies and x-rays and so forth, written documentation. That's the highest one that we want, but at least multiple witnesses who can confirm that a person really was sick and so forth. So if someone comes up and says they were healed, but we can never confirm they were really sick outside of just their testimony, it's going to be we might be a little bit suspicious or a little bit pessimistic towards that. Next one is the illness was organic and not psychosomatic. This is important because there are times where people can be psychosomatically blind or paralyzed to where there's actually nothing biologically wrong with them. You can do every test and there's nothing, like there's no nerve damage, there's nothing wrong with them, but the mind-brain connection isn't there. And so people think that they're blind or think that they can't move when the brain is just not connecting, but there's no objective damage. And so we don't want this because people can, through the placebo effect and through suggestion and so forth, can come out of that if they're not really sick. And so you have to be careful. So we want to make sure this is something they're actually sick with and it's not just in their head. So if we can confirm they really have a tumor or they really have a broken bone, those things can't just psychosomatically be fixed, even if they think they are. So organic is the next one. Next one, it needs to be progressive. So we want a disease that's either been there for a while, like it's not just something that you happen to get yesterday and that can just go away over time, but something that you've had for a while, and not only just had for a while, but typically getting worse. So a disease that's resisted treatment, that's progressively gotten worse as you got older, is much, much less likely to remit or to go away than a disease that was already getting better. So if you were sick and were already getting better and already improving before the time of the miracle, that's going to hurt the chances of it, because you could say, well, if they were already getting better before, there could be biological mechanisms to this. And so a disease that was not only not improving, but was getting worse, that suddenly gets completely better, that's quite strange and quite different than how we would look at a biological healing. The healing is permanent, not temporary. That should be obvious. Now, obviously, everyone dies, right? So even if people raise from the dead temporarily, they're going to do that. They're going to get sick again, but they shouldn't have a remission of the same illness. So this is why typically the Catholic Church, depending on the circumstance, has a 10-year waiting period, usually, especially if it's like a cancer, because sometimes things can go into relapse and come back when people think it's healed. There's actually a pretty publicized case that happened a couple of years ago of a man who had been diagnosed with, I think, stage 3 or 4 cancer and was dying, but he went and tried to use his last days to help finance and build his local church, and the cancer went away inexplicably, and people call this a miracle. Well, a few years after that news report came out, his cancer came back and he ended up dying from it. So we just be careful with stuff like that. And I've seen my own experience where people thought they were healed, and it ended up coming back a little bit later. And it's like, well, it probably isn't going to be a miracle in that sense. Healing was instantaneous. I think this is one of the most important ones, or at least one of the ones that makes it stand out, is that it needs to be something that happened rapidly or extremely quickly, preferably like within a few minutes or a few hours, typically no more than like a day or two. Like overnight is okay, but usually not something that took like a week or two to improve, because we know the human immune system can work over time, that your cells help build you up and that you can get better with therapy and so forth. But if it happens instantaneously, that's hard to explain through the immune system, because your immune system is made up of billions and millions of small cells that have to work in large amounts over time. So your body can't make that many cells that quickly to do that. So that's why an instantaneous healing is a lot more difficult to explain than a gradual healing where the body is building itself over time. Just like, for example, if you were driving in your neighborhood and then the next day there was a huge skyscraper overnight, that would be incredible. But if you were driving and you saw them starting to build a foundation, and a couple weeks later it was a little bit, and it kept getting built over time, well, that's a lot easier to explain, because that's how it is. But skyscrapers don't just pop up overnight; they take a while to build, and the human body is the same way. Healing was complete and not merely partial. So not that someone just improved, they didn't just get better, but they still are technically sick, but that they are complete to the point, and this is an important distinction, they are complete to the point of not needing any treatments for that disease or medications. So the reason that distinction is there is because there are cases where people are healed and that when they still do blood tests, they still technically have the disease and yet they're completely asymptomatic. So there are cases where people have had broken spines and are prayed for and can walk again, and yet the x-ray show their spine's still broken and the nerves aren't even connecting, so they shouldn't be able to walk, and yet they are and have no issues. That's unusual. Just like if you had a completely damaged eye that had all the nerve endings broken off, and yet you were able to see out of it suddenly, even if the nerves were still broken, you could see, you would still be functional. So we're looking for functionality. Whereas an example, if someone was in a wheelchair and you prayed for them, they got healed, and now they can use a walker, now they can use the crutches, but they're still like immobile and they're better. That wouldn't count as a complete healing because they still have to have those treatments. So we want someone completely off of any treatments, even if the organic damage is still technically there. Although there are cases where the organic damage goes away. And last one should be obvious. Healing needs to be spontaneous. So something that can't be attributed to medicine or treatment. So this is why very rarely do I do cancer cases, because people usually take chemotherapy and cancer can go into spontaneous remission. But we want diseases where treatment clearly did not work and it can't be attributable to saying, well, they were taking their medicine and that's what healed them. So I've acronymed this with MOPICS, as I think is easier to remember than the Lambertini criteria.
I was thinking more of mop picks. So when I see a mop, a picture of a mop,
I think of like Mo, like I want more, like Mo, like I want more pictures. Give me more pics. But mop pics works too. Plus, it gets you the two P's in there, right? Yeah. Do you have any like I don't know, like Dale or Dave? Do you agree with those? Do you have any critiques of those or anything that you think should be added?
No, I think those are perfect. Like I told you before, I thought I think it's a brilliant process. I think it's good, and I think it's needed, because you go to some of these word of faith churches that abuse the practices of Christianity, and these healings and stuff like that are just not happening, and they claim they are happening, and it's, I think if we have a criteria like this that needs to be met, I think it not only helps the credibility of the church, but it also helps the outsiders looking in to say, okay, look, these guys went through a rigorous process,
Right.
So yeah, I agree with them.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Did you want to respond to Dave?
I was going to say, go ahead, Dale, but you already got ahead of me. So
okay. Yeah. So I do agree. I was listening very carefully to your things. I think it's reminiscent of the same criteria that Lord's has, for example, but I think this is more comprehensive. So this is even better.
Lord's does use this criteria. And funny you mentioned that, because I have a slide on Lord's, but,
nice.
but yeah, they do use this criteria. Although I will say, although I agree with the criteria, I do sometimes disagree with how they're applied. And so like they're good in principle, but there are cases that they've accepted where it's like, I don't think that it technically counts. So like there is one of the Lord's ones. I don't want to get ahead, but there is one example of a girl who had a certain cancer in her pelvis. She went to Lord's, nothing happened, but a few months later, she was able to walk again. But she still had to, which first of all, it's not instantaneous. And second, she still had to get, her foot was still crooked from the bone damage. So she had to get surgery to correct it. So I'm like, that seems like it's not spontaneous nor instantaneous, but they still counted it because the particular kind of cancer is one that doesn't usually go away or something from a medical technicality. So that was their reasoning, but yeah.
And I like that point too. Like these are like a best case scenario. This is like a sufficient criteria, but they're not necessary, right? Like, for example, I can think of examples. Maybe if we have a video and it's a credible video, and instead of documents or something, that could work in certain cases, but it's not as good as having medical documentation.
Sure. And there are cases where there are ones where I will hold, where I have, so like, for example, like I said, most of these are 6s or 7s, almost all. And usually it depends on which one, because there are some ones where it can be a 6, but one of them is so important that it would disqualify it, even if it had the other ones. And there are some of them where it can get, so like, for example, one of the ones that's a 5 instead of a 7 is the case of Delia Knox, who I don't have it on a slide here, but this one's on video since you brought it up. She was paralyzed for 22 years from a car accident. From that injury. So she doesn't, I don't think, and she was prayed for at a conference. Actually, she wasn't prayed for. She was praying for someone else for something different and was healed and started walking. Now, it wasn't instantaneous. She had to have a little bit, originally they had to, help her out because her muscles were so atrophied out of the wheelchair. And it took her, I think, a few weeks before she was walking in, but the healing was complete. It was organic, all that stuff. And the reason why that's why I counted that, even though we don't, and she hasn't, to my knowledge, released documentation of that, is because, first of all, we have documentation she was really a paraplegic for 22 years. There are plenty of photos and testimony of people going back that long. It's also because, although it was not instantaneous, which would have been better, it's because the nature of it was so different that it couldn't be explained, even if it was like gradual. So I don't want to get too technical, but there's a difference in miracles between preternatural and supernatural, or like contranatural. Most of these kinds of miracles are preternatural, where it's something that could get better, but it's the circumstances. Like, okay, if someone has a broken bone, and it was broken bones can get better over time. But if someone had a broken bone and was instantly healed in the name of Jesus within like a few hours, that would be like that. It doesn't happen that fast. It doesn't happen to that degree without like a cast or something. So that would be preternatural. It's like, okay, it can, but it can't happen in that way, and that's what most of these criteria are meant to do. But if if an amputee got an arm back, let's say, but it happened over a few days or a few weeks, where it was like a stump and then it started growing out, and that would still be impressive, even if it was gradual, right? Because that's not something that can happen even gradually. Yeah. So for Delia's case, because she had been paralyzed for 22 years, first of all, even though she hadn't released the exact thing, I could not find, and I've talked to Joe Bergeron, who's a specialist in rehabilitation. That's actually like his specialty. We couldn't find any case of someone. Most paraplegia, of at least like whether it's a head injury or spinal injury, it's either permanent and that's irreversible if it's like a severe spinal injury, or if it's something that's treatable that gets better over time. Usually the person's walking again within about a few months to a year. I was only until like the most I could find was like one case of someone who was paralyzed, but they were able to start walking in like 6 months or so. There was one case of someone who took 17 years to heal, but he got better gradually, but he was able to walk again within, I think, the first 18 months or so with rehabilitation. Delia had rehabilitation for at least 5 to 10 years after her accident. Never got any better, and then just given up getting improvement for the next 10. So I don't know. I could not find any example of someone being paralyzed for that long being able to walk again. So that to me was indication that this was like an irreparable paraplegia, which we do know exists. People who are permanently paralyzed from the waist down. So rather than someone who's temporarily paralyzed can get better just because it doesn't fit the symptom. So that's an example where we could say, okay, it doesn't fulfill that, but it's one of those that can't get better on its own, and that is literally impossible to fix, at least currently. And so that's why it was an exception. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. Perfect answer. That makes total sense. I have one nitpick. I know you address it later, but for example, these are your criteria to identify a miracle, and you define miracle as an event that only God could do. Now, just looking at these 7 here, Satan could do these. An angel could do these kind of things. So, like, I think these 7 would establish maybe a supernatural or preternatural event or an extraordinary event, but it's not proving a miracle, at least not yet. That's just a nitpick, but
yeah. So you could just you could nitpick at the definition, say that which not could happen without supernatural intervention. I will grant that's a stage 2 part of the stage 1 is establishing these happen. Stage 2 is establishing that what the cause is. So that would be a discussion for stage 2. But you're not wrong on that. Technically they could, but I would have arguments for why in certain cases, God's a better inference than Satan or some other supernatural being. So cool. Yeah, with that, so let me give an example of a case I think would fulfill this, at least to my knowledge, at least most of them. So this is a case from about 50 years ago or so for a man named Marvin Bird. Marvin was in his mid-40s or so when he first started having heart attacks, which is fairly young, back in the 1950s. So this progressively got worse to the point where he he was hospitalized 17 times in a 16-year period, so it's over 1 a year. And he got progressively worse and was on many medications that didn't help. And so in 1970, I have a picture of his audiogram here. The quality's not great because, again, it's fairly old. But basically, the audiogram showed that he had one artery was completely blocked off and closed, and the other one is 50% blocked off. And this is why he kept having frequent heart attacks. And the only way to treat this at the time was a bypass surgery, where you go in and cut the organ, cut the heart, and so forth. And he didn't want to risk that because it's a pretty high risk surgery, especially back then. So he basically continued to put up with his worsening state. he eventually got to the point where he wasn't even able to really go out. He would have to be either in a wheelchair or he was basically bedbound, but he could hardly even stand or walk much without getting out of breath and without feeling extreme pain in his chest. So it got progressively worse. And October 13th of 1972, he had another heart attack while he was driving, was rushed in the ambulance to the hospital. And at that point, they told him, like, you're probably going to have to be in hospice care, at least if you're going to be sent home, you're probably going to, we're not expecting to live for much longer because it's, your heart's basically so blocked at this point, barely any blood's going to get through. So you're not going to be able to make it at this point. So he goes home that month and is basically just accepted that he might get close to dying and his wife's taking care of him. So someone recommends that, there's a famous faith healer named Catherine Coleman. She was big back in the 70s and 60s in town, visiting fairly close. Actually, I don't remember how far away it was, but someone recommended that they go see him. And at this point, Marvin's like, well, I don't really know if God will heal, but at this point, it can't hurt because I'm dying. So what the heck? So about a month after that accident, he goes on November 19th to the auditorium. Catherine Coleman's there. And while she's, worshiping God and doing all this stuff, one of the ushers comes and lays hands on Marvin and starts praying for him. And at this point, he stops feeling pain in his chest and he gets out of the wheelchair and starts walking and feels like he can breathe again and is not out of breath and so forth. So he's elated. So he was a little bit hesitant at first. He was worried, well, maybe this is just a placebo. Maybe I'm just optimistic. So, but he goes home that night and goes out with his wife and they walk and they go get a dinner together that he's able to eat orally for the first time in months because he'd barely even be able to eat properly before a few months prior to that. And the next day, he even was able to help his wife go to the grocery store and carry really heavy bags of groceries, even though he could barely even move prior to that. And so he felt really good. So then on November 21st, this is 2 days after his healing, he goes to his cardiologist. He calls him, makes an appointment, goes to his cardiologist. The cardiologist measures his heart rate at 72 beats per minute. So a normal heart rate is between 60 to 100. That's a healthy. 72 is within a normal range. His heart rate the week prior to that, because he'd been to the doctor's a week prior to that, was 48, which is definitely below the 60 threshold. So it was at a pretty dangerous level. 72, it was normal. So there was an objective change to his heart rate. So at that point, he quits all of his medications, and he's interviewed by Richard Kasdorf, whose book I got this case from. He's a medical doctor who documented some of Kuhlman's healings. And he interviewed Marvin Bird about 2.5 years later. Marvin was still in full health, was off his medications, had not been hospitalized since, was still perfectly mobile, and from all accounts hadn't had any kind of relapses. And so Kasdorf says this is an incredible healing that's medically inexplicable in a religious context. So I would say if we look at the circumstance of this case, this does seem to pass all of those criteria. We can say, first of all, it's medically documented. We have the audiograms, we have the tests from before and after he was healed. We know that the disease was organic because, again, we have pictures of the arteries being blocked. It's not just a psychosomatic where the pain's in his head. We can show that there's actually objective damage to the heart and blocking of the arteries. We know that the disease was progressive. It was not getting better. It was getting worse, as he got older, where he was bedbound and wasn't able to walk and so forth. So we know it was a progressive disease. We know that I think that the one you could maybe question was whether it was permanent. Now, we do know that it was long lasting because he was interviewed years later and it was still healed. You could say 2.5 years isn't enough. Maybe we would need like a checkup 10 years later. That's fair. But at least with the data we have, we know that it stayed healed at least a few years later. So we don't have any evidence that it relapsed as far as we know. So there are at least some checkups done. We can say that it was instantaneous. He didn't get better, a while after he was healed. He got up instantly at the service and felt no more pain, and he was fine that day onward. So he went from being unable to really move from his chest pain to being able to walk and carry groceries within, a few hours or a few minutes. So that's remarkably fast. And we can say that it was complete. He didn't need any more medication. He didn't need the wheelchair. He wasn't bedbound. He seemed perfectly functional. And lastly, we can say that it was spontaneous because he was on medications for decades that did nothing to help him. And yet he was able to get better instantaneously without any kind of surgery. So I would say this is where we can go through and literally say, check all of these off and say, yeah, this is a pretty surprising medically inexplicable healing of arteriosclerotic heart disease. So I think that is, when you have examples like that you can list, that is definitive of a healing that's quite remarkable. So any comments on that before I move on?
Go ahead, Dale.
I guess I would just say, like, obviously I don't have the details, so I'm just going to assume you're being factual and stuff like that in terms of it fulfilling each of the 7 criteria here. Out of curiosity, do you have like access to the medical documents, or I think you said you got this case from a book or something?
Yeah, I have a picture of one of the audiograms up here. In terms of the other stuff, the documents. So Cassadorf reviewed all of the documents for the book and like cites them pretty extensively. Talked to all the, he talked about this in the foreword. He talked to all the doctors and cites like which hospital it was, the date it was, quotes from it pretty extensively. So yeah, it definitely was documented by that. You know, I can give the names of the doctors, give the names of the hospitals, and the dates of all the relevant stuff. So yeah, it's pretty extensively documented. So I would say it's pretty good. Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah. So yeah, that's just an example of how this filled. The one other one we'll talk about is in Lourdes. Now Lourdes, Dale had brought this up earlier, which I'm glad he did because it was relevant. So Lourdes is another interesting test case because it's kind of the epitome of putting this into practice. So we talked about the canonization process of the Catholic Church. This is another example where the church kind of uses this method to scientifically investigate miracles. So in the 19th century, we have in 1858, we have a young French girl named Bernadette Subois or Subaru. I don't know if Dale knows French probably better than I do because he's Canadian, or maybe not. But
well, see, I know Quebecois. That's different than French.
Probably. We'll go with it. Yeah. So she says that the Virgin Mary appeared to her, and she saw, I think it was like 18 different times. Maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was 20. I forget the exact number. But she sees and has conversations with who she says the Virgin Mary, because it revealed to her that was the Virgin Mary. And apparently Mary showed her this spring water that could help heal illness and was like blessed and all this stuff. So people built a church there in Lourdes. And this was at a time where rationalism was still really popular. This was right after the French Revolution. So Catholicism was pretty disliked among the secularists. But this water is established and people start reporting being healed to the point where eventually a medical bureau was established of doctors to investigate this and actually like try to document some of this stuff. And so since 1858, there have been 70 certified official miracles. Now that's actually, that might sound like a lot, but that's quite small compared, within the over 150 year range in which has been going on for. And that's because these criteria are pretty strict. So you can get ones that are maybe 5s or 6s that wouldn't count. But although people like to quote that and say, well, Lourdes has a less than 1% success rate because thousands of people go there every year, take in mind that there are probably around 2,500 to even as much as 5,000 cases that Lourdes documents that they say are medically like remarkable, that they wouldn't say it's like a miracle, doesn't necessarily fill all those, but it's still quite incredible. So you still have thousands of cases where something interesting has happened. And so I think people often take the 70 number out of context. The most recent one, by the way, was in 2018. I didn't include it here, but it was of a nun who had been paralyzed she had gotten progressively more paralyzed over the course of several decades, where she had to be in a boot and was in a wheelchair and was on like a lot of morphine, goes to Lourdes and was 3 days later, like while she was praying, instantly felt no pain, was able to walk, not only just walk, but like was able to walk with her sister for a couple miles that day and had no atrophy and completely instantaneously healed of all that stuff. So that was the most recent one back in 2018. It happened in 2008, but it was certified in 2018 because they waited 10 years to make sure there were no relapses. So that's the overall part of Lourdes. Now, this is the picture. This is Bernadette, the young girl, and this is a picture just of the baths of Lourdes where they put people in the pools, and this is how they do that. A lot of sick people doing that. So one case I have here is a little bit older. It's from the 1800s, but it's one of those. So normally I wouldn't use a case that's that old unless it's something that's like undeniably like that you couldn't misdiagnose, or that's so visually obvious that you wouldn't really need modern medical instruments to diagnose. And so that's going to be one of the cases I discuss here. So this one is of a woman named, I think it's Marie Lemechard, but I think it's pronounced Marie Lemechon if it's going to be French. So here we have Marie Lemechon. Now, people who can see the picture, you can see why that would be. This isn't a picture of her, but a picture of what the disease is. So she was 18 at the time, and she had lupus and tuberculosis of the face. We would call this now probably lupus vulgaris, which is basically where the tuberculosis is eaten away most of the face. The lips are swollen, the nose and cartilage are eaten away, and there's nothing but these huge, bloody, pussy sores all over the face. She'd been suffering for this for years. There were ulcers also on her legs and arms, and so she really couldn't walk very easily because of the sores on her legs. And she'd been coughing up blood for several months at this point. before she goes to Lourdes. So it's been going on about 3 years for all the disability. So right before she goes to Lourdes, in July of 1892, she gets a certificate from her doctor, because usually you have to get permission from your doctor to go to Lourdes, because a lot of people were too sick to even travel. She gets a certificate from her doctor saying that she has tuberculosis in both of her lungs. She's coughing up blood. She has nightly fevers, and she has sores all over her body and her face, some of which are as big as a hand. So she goes to Lourdes the next month in August in 1892, and she's wearing a veil over her face because obviously she's embarrassed and doesn't want people to see her. But there were people on the train who commented, and we have their testimonies. Like one doctor who happened to be traveling on the train comments. He talks about her, quote, revolting face. Both cheeks, the lower part of her nose, and the upper lip were covered with a tuberculosis ulcer that secreted matter abundantly. Another testimony, actually from a skeptic named Emile Zola, describes her in an even more offensive way. And he actually had seen her when he was at Lourdes before she was healed. In his book, he describes her as, quote, from underneath the veil, a hoarse voice growled. The head looked hideously like a monster with its rough hair and round staring eyes. The cartilage of the nose was almost eaten away. The mouth was drawn all on one side by the swollen condition of the upper lip. The whole was a fright, a fully distorted mass of matter and oozing blood. So you have this really, for lack of a better term, ugly appearance of these sores that have just eaten away at the face, or where they barely look like a human anymore. Kind of like a very severe form of what leprosy would look like, but with tuberculosis. And so Marie goes to the pools of Lourdes. She prays on behalf of the Virgin Mary to please heal her, to forgive her of her sins and have mercy on her. She goes in the pool and comes out. And first thing she notices is that there's no pain. And so she actually looks down like, oh, I can walk again. I don't feel pain. And then she realizes the bandages aren't really fitting on her face well, because when she took the veil off, she had, bandages to cover up all the pus. And so she takes the bandages off, and in front of everybody, her face is now completely healed. The only difference is that it's slightly pink and red. Like when you've rubbed your face really hard, it was a little bit light pink. But other than that, all the sores had closed instantaneously and in front of everybody. And she was also able to walk, and the sores on her legs were also gone. So all the doctors at Lourdes immediately look at her and investigate and study her and see that, oh yeah, she clearly is healed, and she's able to walk, and she's no longer coughing up blood, and her face is obviously instantly healed. 10 days later, she goes back to her doctor, and her doctor signs a note about this and talks about how she'd been healed. Dr. Lenil, and I have the quote here from his documentation. This is on August 30th, I think, of 1892, where he says, I saw the invalid Marie immediately on her return. I did not recognize her. So much was changed. I saw a graceful young girl come towards me instead of the mass of humanity with a horrible and monstrous face, which I had seen 10 days previously. Tuberculosis has also disappeared. The cure has lasted. And so Marie then a few years later is discussed at a medical conference held in Paris. This was a pretty big deal back at the time. So in 1894, they held a medical conference in Paris, which was mostly filled with medical students and doctors. And they read out the description from the doctor's testimonies from Emile Zola's book. And then they present Miss Madame Marie Lemarchand, who is now healed, and everyone can see, and everyone was amazed. And I have a picture here, a screenshot from the newspaper at the time from 1894, discussing this. So I forgot to mention that on the slide before here. This is a picture of her about 7 years after healing, and clearly she looks, from what I can tell, pretty normal. Wouldn't have been able to tell she'd had a disfigured face in that way. So that is just another example of a healing that I think would fulfill almost all those criteria in terms of being instantaneous, organic, to the point where it's like visually obvious to everyone in that way, and completely lasting even several years later. So I think it'd be hard to explain naturally. So any thoughts on that, David?
No, I think they're good. I think I wish I'd have had a picture of her like before.
Yeah, well, that's why I tried to find
a drawing, right?
Yeah, well, drawings of like the same kind of disease, right? Of that.
Yeah.
Like when you have plenty of descriptions of that, it's pretty easy to.
But I'm sure she wasn't going to get family photos or anything.
Yeah, well,
that disease.
1890 photography was not like everyone just had a cell phone. Or
right.
Plus, would you want a picture of yourself like that? I don't think you would.
Yeah, I know. I don't think I would either. Dale?
Caleb, let me ask this. So with these two cases or other cases, but obviously we covered the two that you did here. Okay, so great. So these are the best we've got. They fulfill all 7 of your criteria. I want to pose it to you. What is the best objections to this from informed skeptics? I don't care about lay skeptics, like people who have actually taken the time to study this. What are the best objections to these cases?
Well, to be honest, there's really not that many people who've studied these cases in depth. At least it's really hard. From my interactions with people like James Fedor and stuff, who've been helpful and giving me feedback, the thing that I don't think they say this implicitly, but they say this explicitly. What they implicitly do is I think they almost like tacitly kind of accept the criteria, but they deny it in the cases. So like if I like I have a case of a person who is blind with organic blindness instantly healed, and they basically questioned whether the diagnosis was right, and then they questioned whether it was instantaneous. So although all the facts you can present imply that, they're like, well, maybe he got better and just didn't report it, and it wasn't actually instantaneous, and he just didn't either know or didn't notice or didn't report it. So I think what you'd have to do is you basically have to try to knock down or to draw into question some of those criteria, or you could just say, yeah, it's weird, but we don't know. For Marie Lemachon's case, Emile Zola, who was the skeptic who had seen her, he didn't deny that she was healed or sick. But he said this was hysteria, that this was psychosomatic, and that the brain can pull tricks. Now, this was in 1890, so that obviously that sounds stupid to us today to say, well, you know, if you have wishful enough thinking, you can fix the facial disfigurement. But that was basically what he tried to argue, that everyone at Lourdes was just mentally messed up, and that it was all in their head when they were healed, even though there were plenty of objective features of them that were apparent to everybody. So yeah.
Were there the doctors at Lourdes, did they actually have written documentation with that? Yeah.
That's wild. There's her primary physician from her hometown.
Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
They have, because there are doctors at Lourdes already, they usually investigate the day. Like, you'll go and say, oh, there's a healing, and let's go investigate it. And they do. And so they do that. And then she went back to her doctor. And so you have her doctor's written test. Usually when they investigate this, they have to investigate it themselves. And then they have to have written things from her doctor talking about what was the diagnosis, and can you confirm she was your patient, and all this stuff. And can you like look at her now and look at it and give us your medical opinion. So it's trying to get multiple doctors to comment on it and to make sure everything's on the uppity up at that point.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Dale, anything else?
On not on these particular cases. Yeah, I do have like random question. I don't know, like, do you still have more to your presentation?
No, that was all the ones I was going to do just for this, because we spent a lot of time on the other stuff. So that's all I was going to do for this one. These were ones I didn't do on camera stream because, you know, as I said, I had 50. I did 5 on his, so I'm just piecing out some here, some there, some there.
I can tell you. I can tell you. I looked up the blind guy. What was his name again? Mr. Spencer. Yeah. I looked that one up, and that was a really good one. I thought you did. And when I looked into it, I couldn't find anything that would debunk it at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like
the documentation and everything on there you could read.
Yeah, I read it. I even looked it up on all the different terminology and stuff like that to see if there could be something that, like, okay, there's a brain thing where it made him blind for a few days.
Well, no, because he had macular degeneration, which is typically that's subjective deterioration of the macula. That doesn't normally that it's hereditary too. So there is age related ones, but in his case, usually hereditary stuff doesn't go away. Like that's
exactly. And the thing that really got me was that what made me skeptical and why I looked into it was because it happened to him twice, right?
Once it had gotten better. Well, as a kid, it wasn't that same diagnosis. But he had like inflammation of the eyes when he was younger, and it gotten better over time.
Yeah, so, and that's what kind of like it gave me, and then once I started looking up the terms and stuff, I was like, there's no way. There's no coming back from that.
Yeah, macular degeneration doesn't usually go away. Yeah, especially hereditary macular degeneration. There are studies where it's gotten better, where they like deny chart and like improved by like a line or so. But he went from 20/400 visual acuity to 20/30, which is what he was before. Instantaneous, that's like wild. Within 2 weeks verification. So that's pretty hard to do. And so like what people like James will say is like, well, maybe he got better. Maybe it was a different diagnosis and it was misdiagnosis, and then maybe he had gotten better over time but didn't notice. But then my inclination is like, well, he was on, when you're 20/400 and you already have like super prescription glasses, and even you're legally blind, you go to 20/30, which is like almost normal vision, like almost perfect. There's no way you're not going to notice that. I would think because I mean, have you ever tried someone's like glasses on that are you're saying you'd be walking around with normal eyes with a 20/400 prescription and not notice the change? Like that just seems almost incredible to me. So that's
Right on. Well, okay, so now I'm gonna since you presented your cases, you presented us you haven't made like the total argument yet, which I think you probably not finished developing. You're just
well, I have.
establishing.
I didn't plan on
Yeah.
doing it here because
Yeah, I'm not gonna push you there. But what I'm gonna do is ask you the question that you keep alluding to, but you're not really answering. But you've said it twice, and I had the same question. It is, are miracles unfair and thus an act of an all-loving God?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think it gets brought up that much, and that's why I was excited to talk about it, because it's like, oh, this is an interesting argument that they're unfair, because the idea is that if God's all good, he should be fair, because fairness is a good thing. And so God to heal, like if you're going to say, okay, God has reasons to not heal us, to have us endure through suffering and get closer to him, fine, we can accept that. But then you can't go saying, oh, but he'll help you sometimes, he'll heal you sometimes, right? So it's like either basically they try to say either God should be beneficial in helping everybody, or if he's going to stay out of it to help us work through our suffering, he should do that for everybody, not basically pick favorites where he sometimes heals and sometimes doesn't. And that's it. Or it's it with giving evidence. Like, why do these people get evidence for a direct miracle, but other people don't, right? And they just have testimony. Why do some people get direct experience and others don't? So those are the kind of the ideas about that. And so the answer to that is very long, and I talk about in the chapter, but the short thing I would say is that I think I would actually say that there's good reason for God to do a middle ground. So I reject that dichotomy that either he has to always be doing this or he has to never be doing it. I think I would call it the Goldilocks zone. I think there's a middle ground to where if we lived in a world where God was directly obvious and interacting with everybody, it would get rid of our ability to like discipline ourselves and to really be free and to discover things and to soul build, But if we lived in a world where God never intervened, it was purely deistic, I think that would hamper our relationships with him. It would make there be evils that would be hard to get defeated. So we would just we would be pessimistic towards him or apathetic. And so I think God leaves us breadcrumbs without giving us the whole sandwich. And so I think there are times where God drops hints and does this enough to know that he's there, enough to do that and to build confidence, but not so much to where we would be expecting a miracle every day. Also, the idea that miracles are unpredictable is what makes them powerful. If everyone got the same level of suffering and the same level of relief, there would be first of all, there'd be a sense of entitlement. And there's second, that would also make the suffering a lot less bad. And it would also make the relief from that suffering a lot less good, because the whole point is they were surprised by it. And it was like happy for them. Whereas, oh, okay, I'm going to get healed in 5 minutes. Don't worry, because God has to heal me. Right. So that's where I think that would be, those would be some reasons. So I think that diversity is good. Also, I'll just say from all the testimonies that I've seen, I've never seen anyone healed who was ungrateful for that. I think that miracles help us build virtues like patience and trust for testimony, for one. Like, oh, well, why didn't I see it? Well, I think the point that we have to sometimes trust people, like what Neil was saying, is a virtue. Not just believing everything. Like it's careful, as we've said. It's not just pure credulity, but when you look at the history of skepticism towards miracles, a lot of it, I'm not saying this is everyone, but a lot of it historically has been people who were prejudiced. Everyone knows the argument for the resurrection that says that women's testimony wasn't really favored. And we see critics like Celsus making fun of this, like, oh, who sought a woman? And he also was quoted as saying the only people who believe the resurrection claim are the fools, the silly, the idiots, the women, and the children. Like basically, so basically saying, oh, we can't trust them. We do that. Hume does the same thing when he talks about testimony from barbarous and savage nations, which would not be PC by today's standards. But as an 18th century European, he's basically saying non-white countries are the ones who are superstitious and gullible, and aren't we as Europeans so much better because we know how science works, right? It's that bias of I'm just better, we're smarter, we've moved past that. And I think miracles are meant to humble us in that way, where no, you don't always get to see it, because you have to lower and humble yourself and sometimes trust people you wouldn't otherwise trust.
Yeah. And they would be no longer miracles if they happened all the time. And then you'd have to question, as a human in a fallen world and so forth, if they did happen all the time, I mean, what would our motivation be for a relationship with God? It'd be purely like, what can you do for me type of relationship. We'd have a lot of that too.
Absolutely. So I just hop back on the patience thing. Like, as I was saying, I've never seen any case where someone was ungrateful. And I've seen ones of people who've explicitly said that they were that the time actually made them more like Delia Knox, we mentioned earlier, who was paralyzed for 22 years. Never has she said, well, I'm, God healed me, but he should have done it 10 years earlier or something like that. Like, but no, she was like happy. She's like, the fact that I got that mercy and I went through 22 years only makes that so much more beautiful towards me. It makes me even more grateful and happy. And so you don't have this resentment. And I think that's how we'll be in heaven, honestly. I don't think that, oh, well, I got more suffering than he did. That's not fair. I think it'll be an almost like being grateful for the beauty that comes from that and from the healing. And
I
so
also,
I've never
seen I hear you.
Grateful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah. But I didn't mean to cut you off.
Never have I seen someone who was saying, "Oh, God healed me. God made me sick, so He should just never made me." Like everyone's saying, like, "No, I'm glad God let me go through this experience so I could be better because I'm closer to Him now than I was, and I wouldn't have gone if then I hadn't gone through that. And I'm grateful, and it's part of my testimony, and I wouldn't change that for the world. I wouldn't go back and change it. Like that's usually what you hear from these people. It's not God, it's His fault I was sick in the first place or something. Like, and thank goodness He healed me. It's always just pure gratitude, and I think that builds us up as people. So.
Right on. I'd also say that miracles occur when God sees fit to intercede too. Like only He knows the ripple effects throughout time, and what His intercession is going to do at that specific time. And that comes common with an omniscient God, and we have to take that into consideration, and I think that we actually can see evidence of this through the miracles of the New Testament, right? So we get all these miracles within the New Testament in the early part of the church years, but now we have I even wrote this down. One area in the Bible is the mission of the early church and the spread, all the things the disciples did, and that ripple effect is evidenced today by the manuscript tradition we have. We have a place where we've got a very, very well preserved manuscript tradition in the New Testament, and I think that's one of the results of that. So just a thought.
Yeah, it is. I mean, people don't realize how big of an impact those can have. I mean, like look at Paul's conversion, how much that completely changed Christianity, and how much if you think that was a miracle. How different history would look like if Paul wasn't a Christian, or Constantine's conversion with a vision of Jesus, or a vision of a cross. Sorry, how that completely changed the world forever. Or you could even look at modern examples, like if in the Russian Revolution, the czars had a son who had hemophilia, and allegedly Rasputin, who was this Russian mystic, healed him, and he was let in the palace. And long story short, Rasputin being there led to the Russian Revolution. The Soviet Union happened and all that stuff. And of course, the Soviet Union changed history forever. So I'm not saying God healed the kid, but the point is, like, because you have a case where someone was allegedly healed, it did set off this chain of events to where if Alexei had never been healed of hemophilia, at least allegedly healed, we might have never gotten the Soviet Union, and that we wouldn't have gotten the Cold War. We wouldn't have gotten the Berlin Wall, and how different history would look like. Right. So yeah, so little things like that seem insignificant of why doesn't God just heal them?
Yeah.
You don't always know the circumstances.
Yep. And He does. And you would have to expect that if it's God, right?
If you're a Molinist or a foreknowledge,
maximally great. Right?
Yeah, you do, yeah.
Dale, I'll kick it back to you, buddy.
All right, cool. Yeah, so interesting. Excellent answer to that, Caleb. I think I would agree. It's the same, my Molinistic defeater kind of thing. It's the same answer. Why does God answer some prayers and not others, and stuff like that? You give the same answer, right? Like, so I agree largely with what you're saying. So I have three areas to ask about. So the first one is, so I kind of talked to you before. I'm interested in this category of miracle known as religious contests or power encounters, and I'm kind of interested. Have you found any cases that fulfill criteria or come close to it in that category of miracle at all, or?
So Keener does a lot of stuff in that area. That's not something I've looked at. You don't see a lot of that with healing stuff. That being said, and so when you say power encounters, do you mean like the Christianity versus another religion and seeing the Christianity like kind of triumph over that? Is that what you mean by that? Yeah. Yeah, I do know of. I would say the closest thing I talk about in the book to that is like the visions of Jesus, because a lot of those happen in Muslim and Hindu contexts or non-Christian contexts. And you point out that it only goes one direction. You don't see, at least I'm not saying it never happens, but you don't see like statistically a large amount of Christians seeing Vishnu or something, right, and converting. Usually it's they're in one way. So I think that's a point of prevalence. I also think the point that Christianity has always been used miracles for evangelism, whereas most miracles in the Eastern religions and so forth are people who are already followers of that, and they don't like lead to like massive scale conversions. Whereas the early history of Christianity was dominated by healings and resurrections and so forth. And even today in the third world, people like J.P. Moreland estimate it's as high as 70% of new church growth is from healing miracles. Keener says that in some places like China, it can go from 50 to 90% of conversions in some, especially in the rural areas, are because of faith healing experiences. So you have these really high percentages of people converting because they've seen Christians do miracles, and leaving their own religions or own traditions, sometimes that they had for centuries. So I don't think you see that same kind of phenomenon happening in other religions in terms of people leaving their beliefs for it on a wide scale. Usually it's people who already believe in it that happen to report those miracles and within their own religion. So that's what I would say.
All right, awesome. So that kind of answers like my next question to you is, so like I've kind of talked to you about, okay, the religious significance criterion, right? When I identify miracles, I utilize specified complexity and through the lens of intelligent design. So your 7 criteria kind of relate to the complexity aspect. It's an extraordinary event or a supernatural event, but then there's that second aspect that is important to me, like how do we not just attribute it to God, but most importantly, this is my kind of reason for being a little bit skeptical in terms of using this as a proof for Christianity. Like, how do we say God is doing these miracle healings to authenticate Christianity versus for compassionate reasons or something like that?
Yeah. So first of all, like in terms of how do we get to God, right? So you are correct that religious context is important. And that the reason I don't include that in the initial criteria is because that's a stage 2 part. So stage 1 is just do not. I would say like contra natural, like healings that go against natural understandings of how the human body works. Do those happen? I would say yes. Here's some examples, given. And then when we look at, okay, what's the cause of them? I would say one of the parallels you see with these is that all the ones that I'm aware of, and that as far as I know anyone's aware of, that fulfill these the best are in religious contexts. Like to my knowledge, there's not many secular examples, if any, of a healing with all these criteria met that's at the same level as some of these within the. So the fact that there's no so if there was like a correlation we could find biologically, that even if we didn't know exactly what it was, that would be, I think, evidence for a natural cause. And so we have examples like with cancer, for example. So cancer can go into remission. We don't always know why it does, but there are studies that show that people who get infections are more likely to have cancer remit than if they didn't. And that's, some people say it's because the immune system is fighting off the infection, and it also happens to help fight the tumor and stuff. Different reasons for that. But the point is, even if we didn't know exactly why, we could say that's a decent hypothesis if there's a positive correlation there. So if you could find like all people who were healed of blindness had this particular thing and this particular gene, and that if you could find that, I think that would help the natural hypothesis. But my argument is that not only do we have a very wide range of healings that are all different, paralysis, blindness, all the different stuff, that you'd have to posit many different independent kind of mechanisms for. You also happen to have that there's no real correlations or similarities other than the fact these all happened immediately after prayer. And if that's your only correlation, then I think that's where you kind of get to the religious significance as possibly part of that explanation. And that's where you would posit God and so forth. In terms of Christianity, rather than being beneficial, I agree that God can heal people in other contexts for being merciful. I don't deny that, but that's where I would appeal to what I said earlier about Christianity is the only religion that does this to convert people as well. And if you think God is just healing people like Muslims and doing this out of compassion, it's weird that he's doing this deliberately, at least knowing the intention that they'll convert to Christianity. Whereas if he just didn't care about the context, you would think it'd be either reciprocal or would happen within their own religion and so forth. So that's why I think Christianity is significant in that way.
All right, cool. All right, and the last question that I wanted to get your take on, it was something you mentioned in the capturing Christianity thing that I actually think is very interesting, and I agree with you, and I think David Russell disagrees, if I'm correct. But you mentioned that you compared the evidence from modern miracle healings for the truth of Christianity to the evidence for Jesus's resurrection, and you said,
Oh yeah,
in some cases, I think it's better than what we have for the historical case for the resurrection.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment on that, and we can discuss that?
So I think that when we put our apologetic, I'm trying to say this carefully. I'm not saying that we can't look at the evidence objectively of Christianity, but I do think some Christians, not all, do have a tendency to exaggerate the evidence of resurrection or act as if it's like the best. But it depends on what criteria you're setting, right? So if we're doing like numbers of witnesses, if we're doing how long after the events it was written, if we're doing the education level and the credibility of the witnesses, you could lay out those criteria and you would have plenty of cases that are better than the resurrection. That's not to say the resurrection's bad, but it depends on what you do. But you don't want to gerrymander it to where you're specifically making it hyper specific to the resurrection arbitrarily, and unless you have good reasons for it. So it depends on what it is. So like I gave the example of the amputee one I mentioned earlier, because that's an older one. It's a couple hundred years old, so it's a bit more analogous to the testimonial evidence of the resurrection. And I think that through most of the criteria, we have more witnesses, we have earlier written down. Now, granted, that's after the printing press, so it's not a fair comparison, but still, it's still, you just have, I think, better versions of this. We even have, in the case that David Russell and I have talked about, that was on Cam's channel, you have something analogous to the resurrection appearances, where we actually have photographs and you have hundreds of thousands of witnesses, which is more than the 500 Paul says. So it's not to say that we need to compete these, because these are Christian miracles in a Christian context. So I think this is evidence for the resurrection and the truth of Christianity. It'd be really weird if you thought the Virgin Mary appeared and Christianity wasn't true, or at least certain tenets of it weren't. So that, I don't see how you could justify these as vindication miracles and then still deny the resurrection. So I think it just complements that. And I think that's what, as Christians, what we should be doing. Even when in Acts, when the disciples are talking about the resurrection, yes, they do give their testimony, people believe them, but they are still healing people. They are still praying for people. And that's what helps towards the conversion. So it's the testimony of the resurrection, absolutely, but that's not just what they were doing. They were doing that and also doing miracles for people to see, that I think added vindication to the resurrection of Jesus. So yeah.
I've got a fascinating follow-up. Sorry, David, I don't want to take over the show. Can I ask one follow-up thing?
Yeah, but we're about to wrap up here, so
okay.
Yeah, you're good.
So here's something that I was interested in back when I was studying as a non-Christian. I got interested in like Dr. Graham Twelftree's research, right? So he, for example, says there's at least 24 miracles outside of the resurrection of Jesus, including healings, that we can prove historically probably happened.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, in terms of the Jesus's miracle healings in the Gospels, we're not going to have medical documentation and stuff, but are there any of those that you think are sufficient to say, yeah, there's probably a miracle in the same way people argue for his resurrection? Or
that's a good question. Yeah, I like that question. Okay, so I'll be honest. I think besides the ascension, because that's kind of tied to the resurrection, right? I would be hesitant. I think if I was going to be cynical, I obviously don't believe this personally, but I would say that if it was, as a critical historian, if I didn't believe in the resurrection, I think you could explain, even if we're not going to posit legends, let's just grant the details in the Gospels are mostly accurate, or generally. I think you could explain most of Jesus's healings if you wanted to, psychosomatically or other things, because we can't, we don't know if they were completely healed. We can't check up on them to make sure that the paralyzed people didn't fall back down a day later. We don't know if it was psychosomatic or organic. Now, leprosy, you could maybe argue that's more obvious. I guess the best one you could do is like when Malchus's ear is cut off and Jesus reattaches it, but that happens at night and in a environment where there's a lot of stuff happening quickly. So could people misremember details? I don't know. So yeah, I think you could cynically explain a lot of those if you wanted to, if you didn't believe Jesus was divine and so forth. And I think I would say that for the skeptic to embrace that, I'd say, yeah, you don't have to believe in miracles. And you don't have to say this is legendary just because it's a miracle. People report stuff like this that's even equally or even equal to or even crazier than this in the modern day. They're eyewitnesses. You can disbelieve them, but that's Keener's whole point, is to say you don't have to say a miracle claim must automatically be a late legend because no one would ever report that. People do report that, whatever the explanation is.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Over to you, David.
All right, Caleb. I think we've put you to the hot seat and to the question long enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can only take so much drilling. I do think I just think the evidence for the resurrection is different. So I mean that's
We'll have
kind
to
of
have a conversation on that.
I would
sometime.
never. Yeah, someday that would be fine. Yeah, and
I mean, it's
like
not
I
a
was
competition.
saying,
I will give a spoiler.
and I agree. That's what I liked your answer. That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, I really think it's it was a good answer that you gave on that. So about like not a competition, but
yeah. Well, all I'll say to that is that I will. Yeah, sorry, you were cutting out a little bit there.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe I was. All I will say is that I might do a little bit of a spoiler. I think Dale will think this is interesting. I'm actually working on a blog post right now, critiquing playing the devil's advocate and actually critiquing the maximal case for the maximal data case, which, as Dale knows, people like Lydia and Tim McGrew use, Jonathan McClatchy, not even attacking the evidence for it. I'm not going to even be bothering to talk about where the gospels are written by eyewitnesses and so forth. In the article, I'm actually going to grant all of that. I will say it's a stage 2 argument. One, you set up the evidence of who wrote the gospels, were they eyewitnesses, all that stuff, were they reporting accurately? And stage 2 is the trilemma of, okay, now that we've established that, were they lying, mistaken, or telling the truth? I'm attacking stage 2. I'm going to grant all of stage 1 for the sake of argument, because they spend most of their time defending stage 1. And I try to give. So I think Dale will think that's really interesting, because I don't think it's really been done very often. But I would argue, I would, just to play devil's advocate, I would argue that as a skeptic, you could still, even if you grant the disciples really did report that they ate and touched Jesus for 40 days, that you couldn't rule out lying or being mistaken, and with the evidence that we have. That's the fun devil's advocate I'll be playing with. And then I'll say, so because the maximal data case doesn't work, and because I don't think the minimal facts works either, we can use the modern miracles to put onto the resurrection, which is what I'm proposing. I'm trying to propose a new apologetic for the resurrection. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of this, not just to poo-poo on other apologists, but just like they would critique the minimal facts because they think it's insufficient. So I'm trying to critique methods that I think are better, but are still lackluster in that way. So that's what I'm hoping to do.
All right. Since you are the miracle man, I got one more fun question for you, or two, and it's just for fun. Okay, so what was the miracle of the Star of Bethlehem, since we're in the Christmas season?
That would probably be a question for Hugh Ross, because if some people want to say it was like this natural like star formation, in which case I don't think it'd be a miracle. It would just be a one. But I don't know if it was a star, if it was like an angel or something like that, that was moving, because if it literally goes on top of a house. So I don't know. I haven't looked enough into that. I don't think that purely historically the evidence for like the birth narrative of Jesus are as good as the resurrection or other stuff. Not to say that I don't believe them or anything, but so like there's so much we don't know in terms of that. There's so much speculation that I couldn't even begin to tell you of what that would consist of. I don't know.
I don't know either, but I think it was a miracle.
No,
I would probably hold closer to that it was something miraculous that God did, or providentially did, or something. But how does a virgin give birth? That's the last one.
Well, I mean, you can have a virgin give birth without divine intervention. It's called oh my gosh, artificial insemination.
There you go.
So, there you go. But not that I'm proposing it's what happened to Mary, but it's not inconceivably. It doesn't even violate the laws of nature. It just depends on how it's doing that. In the case, the Holy Spirit would be the one conceiving that. But yeah, so there's nothing in principle. Just as there's nothing in principle impossible to a person walking on water if it's frozen. So it depends. So you always have to qualify it. So you can't say a virgin can't give birth, unless she's been artificially inseminated. So again, just it depends on the context. And I would say in the case of miracles, yes, it is impossible for a man to rise from the dead. apart from God's intervention. So,
Right.
which is
Right.
the caveat you have to always add in there. So,
All right, Dale, your turn to take a shot at those two.
At those two, like my answer, or you want me to?
Yeah, your answer too.
So yeah, so in terms of the Star of Bethlehem, I'm agnostic. I've heard a bunch of options. One thing that I thought was interesting is they were saying one person was saying it was like an angel or something like that based on the language. This was like an unbelievable debate a long time ago. So like that could be an option. I definitely agree with you, Russell, that it's a miracle. I would disagree with Caleb, even if it's natural. Let's pretend it's, Jupiter and Saturn and thing got together and they became this bright quote unquote star. That can be a miracle based on extraordinary circumstances. The providential timing of that could be intelligently designed by God. So I would still be open to saying it's a miracle, even if it's fully naturally, like a natural event. Like there's no supernatural input. What the other question?
The virgin birth.
How is it possible? Yeah, well, again, it's a supernatural event by God. One thing that's interesting, I remember the skeptics when I was on Skeptics and Seekers probing me about the DNA of, like, oh, did Jesus have 48 chromosomes or something like that? He got half from Mary. Where did the other half come from? So I don't know if you guys have heard those objections.
So silly. But yeah, I just thought I'd ask them for fun since it's the holiday season, and they were miracles.
I will just say, just to end it off on a fun thing, there actually is a study out there you can look up that says 1% of U.S. women who are mothers claim that they're virgins. So 1% of them deny that they ever had sex and are still pregnant. So whether we should take Dale's view and say that they're all, we should believe them or not, I don't know. Maybe we have to put them
it's the midichlorians.
Put them on the Maury show and have them, you are the father or not. Yeah.
What are the Star Wars? The
midichlorians.
Yeah. Anyways, guys, again, thank you so much, Caleb, for coming and giving us that presentation. I thought it was very helpful. I thought it was very good. I think it's going to be fascinating when you create it as an apologetic and as an argument and use it to support the resurrection. And I think that will be
we'll do another show when the book comes out.
Yeah. There'll be an awesome pool to gather 3 different argumentations that will support the resurrection. And Dale, again, thank you for co-hosting with me. I really do appreciate it.
No problem. Hopefully I did a good job. Not too bad with my questions, but
no, you did great. I think
I liked your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I think all the questions here tonight and Caleb's answers were spot on. So thanks again, guys. Caleb, people, you this is not your first book, so tell us where we can get you.
Amazon. If you search Caleb Jackson, there's Resurrection book, which is called Undead, and there's the Theodicy book, which is called Searching for a Solution to Suffering. So those are 2 books. I'm also on a friend's blog called Think Christian Theism, although I'm one of the main contributors on there, but I've written probably about a dozen blog posts or so at this point. Most of them are on the resurrection or historical stuff with like the burial of Jesus or so forth. So check that out. I have some stuff on miracles there. And that's where I'm doing the new article that I'm working on right now about maximal data stuff. So we'll stay tuned for that.
Yeah. And if you want to, if you're okay, like Caleb, you can send me like the slides that you did for like capturing Christianity. I can put that on my blog for people.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
Right on. So again, Dale, tell us where everybody can find you real quick.
So I'm the host of Real Seekers. Everybody knows already. So I'm on realseekerministries.wordpress.com. So that's my blog. That's where I post a bunch of sources and stuff like that for the shows. And I'll be doing the same for this show for people. Or just on YouTube at Real Seekers. And you'll be able to find me on YouTube, Rumble, or Spotify and Anchor.
Right on. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end here. Over the next few weeks, we're going to probably be tackling this with a few surprises. The good old zeitgeist. Yes. The reason is I'm getting a ton of questions about this at my work. This came out like 2007. So I don't know why, but like many people I run into still have questions about this. So I went over and I'm looking at the video, and there's people today commenting on it, talking about how much it's changed your life. So I figured, you know what? Let's get this on every channel, at least some of it, at least cover some of it on
I feel like a lot of
every
it
Christian
is,
channel.
a lot of it's probably on TikTok too, right? I think that's where you would get this like being popular again, just from the.
No, I didn't. This is actually
Just send them
my
the
experience with real people and
Really?
Hey, Russ,
yeah, with other YouTubers and stuff.
Huh.
Yeah.
send them the link to Zeitgeist Debunked and like it
Yeah.
refute everything.
Did you ever see Bill Maher's movie Religulous that came out the same year? He has a
Yeah.
similar he makes the same argument, yeah. Which
Yes.
it's all I could ask him is just ask for a citation from that, which is always the thing.
Right.
Where in the text does it say horses born on December 25th? It's like
Right.
You know what I'm going to do for that show, David? I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to play a little clip from the ultimate mythicist himself, Richard Carrier, saying the Zeitgeist is full of BS. You're in
Robert Price also said that.
Yeah, but you know, Price changed his view on Deborah Murdoch.
Murdoch,
Yeah, he like kind of changed his position on her and said, "I'm reconsidering a lot of her stuff." Yeah, so yeah, it was pretty wild. Anyways, I don't know where he stands now, but that's the last.
You could, he probably would come on if you ever invited him. I'm sure that'd be interesting.
Amicable, yeah,
he's a very nice guy.
But anyways, guys, this is it for tonight. As Tyler would say to everybody, stay safe, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.